we're going to talk about how science avoids the confirmation bias. I've had a lot of dialogues with students and even more commonly with strangers who watch my YouTube videos and make comments on them, implying that scientists are always biased. And it shows a fundamental lack of understanding about putting on our science hat and how we take steps to deliberately avoid just looking for evidence that we're right and ignoring evidence that we might be wrong. So how scientists go about doing it. First off, we admit our errors when we make them. It's really super important for scientists to recognize when something that they published earlier or presented at a conference in the past or other kinds of scenarios where maybe they publicly put out something that turned out to be incorrect, they need to admit those things. It's not uncommon in the academic journals to see what the column is called errata, E-R-R-A-T-A, errata, where they're correcting the errors that happen in previous issues. And a lot of times scientists have to post, corrections where their statistical analysis was incorrect or other kinds of things. And, it's embarrassing. That's why we try not to make them and have to, now they're published and now people can see them. But we have to admit them. Otherwise, the tendency to want to hide from it and pretend like it never happened causes that information to be out in the world and no correction behind it. And it causes us to look like we were seeking information that proves we're right rather than seeking information that is, valid. The peer review and publication process really helps to avoid errors getting into the literature. Now, I talked about earlier how, even in the blind peer review process, if you're famous, you might get a little bit of a pass getting, published, so that things that are picked up as methodological problems if the author is unknown or the institution isn't as prestigious, oftentimes slide by if you're famous enough. But the basic premise in the peer review process is that people who don't know you, have no vested interest in this paper ever getting published, look at the design and the statistics and the conclusions with a really critical eye, looking for evidence of bias. So in general, that sort of safeguards our fields from having a lot of just completely biased, material that hasn't gone through the correct falsification protocols. Another way that we avoid confirmation bias in science is this drive to do replications, right? If a study comes out and other people are like, I wonder if I would get that same outcome, and they run the study exactly the same way and they get the same outcome, it provides a little bit more confidence that the outcome is valid, at least across more than one lab or one scenario, different samples, stuff like that. If it is not replicated, it doesn't necessarily mean that the first author was wrong and the second one is correct, or vice versa. It just means that, maybe this isn't as robust of an effect as, we would like, or, maybe we need to tighten up our design and see if we get a different outcome, right? It just makes you think, and it makes you a lot more careful. So the process of replication produces evidence for or against, the outcome. But also knowing that other people might replicate your study helps to keep a scientist from tweaking things a little bit, or I'm trying to avoid saying the word cheat, cheating a little bit here or there just to get the outcome that they really, really want. Knowing that somebody else might replicate it kind of makes you have to do your best work and admit or embrace whatever comes from the hypothesis test that you do. So it could provide additional support. The thing that we have to say, though, is no matter how many replications come out the same way as the original study, we never say proven, right? We never say that look at that, we've got 5 replications, we have finally proven this hypothesis. All we know so far is we have not yet refuted it. It's really important to remember that. And I pulled this out of Discover magazine. And I highlighted the parts that are kind of interesting. Neutrinos seemed to be traveling faster than light at the particle accelerator. And it turned out that it was not the case that neutrinos were traveling faster than light. There was something that wasn't plugged in correctly. And so it made it look like the neutrinos got to their destination before the light did. So again, a physics example, but what I wanted you to notice is the title. Einstein was right after all. Even Discover magazine, which is a magazine that's written for all different kinds of scientists. I really like this magazine because it provides me a little bit of insight into other fields besides psychology. Occasionally they do a psychology paper in there, but and it's written for, the newsstand. So the average person's supposed to be able to read this and enjoy it. But look what they said. Einstein was right after all. It should say something like, wasn't wrong after all. It shouldn't say he was right, because we don't know that he's right. We don't know that particles always travel slower than light. We just know that in this particular test they did. And we know that Einstein predicted that they would. But this particular test only shows that he isn't wrong yet. And now, this might be a subtle difference. You might be thinking to yourself, like, what's the difference between being right and not being wrong? Like, what's the difference between those two things? It does sound a little arbitrary. But the idea that scientists should carry in their head is that we're putting these hypotheses through falsification tests, and that passing the falsification test means that you are not wrong yet. It doesn't mean that you're right. It just means that you're not wrong yet. Okay, my hypothesis survived this test. Let me do a different test with a different study, different design. Okay, it passed it again, so I'm still not wrong yet. So that's how scientists should be thinking about it. And if you haven't taken statistics yet, you'll notice that there's a null hypothesis and then an alternative hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is always assumed to be true. And the null hypothesis is always that you're wrong. So we always want to be able to reject the null. I'm not wrong. It doesn't mean I'm right. It means I'm not wrong. So yeah, I don't know if that's clearing anything up, but that's the idea. All right. Now, sometimes when you think scientifically in everyday life, especially, people will call you a naysayer rather than a skeptic, right? Like, a naysayer is a person who just says no, who just disagrees to be disagreeable, or disagrees because they have something else in mind besides being objective or being skeptical. Skeptical is where you're questioning things, right? Questioning the method, or questioning the motives, or questioning the outcome. So skepticism has a different motive than naysaying does. Now, one of the basic premises in science is that we should always follow Occam's razor. Occam's razor, apparently Occam did not take his own razor when he wrote his definition of his razor. Occam said, one should not increase beyond what is necessary the number of entities required to explain anything. Okay, that's kind of cumbersomely phrased, Occam. One should not increase beyond what is necessary the number of entities required to explain anything. Okay. You guys might have learned it a little bit more simply as the principle of parsimony, which is one should choose the simplest explanation of a phenomenon. So the principle of parsimony was generated by a different source, a philosopher, but the principle of parsimony says one should choose the simplest explanation of a phenomenon. So when given a choice between a really complex and intricate explanation and a very, what we like to call, elegant and simple explanation, we should always go with the elegant and simple one. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's pick on Freud again. One of the reasons why Freudian theory is problematic is that it has so many entities required to explain whatever it is that Freud's trying to explain. So first thing that Freud introduces that it is kind of complicated is the unconscious. Because as he describes it, the unconscious is like unknowable, really, except for unless you're Freud, in which case you can figure out what's in someone's unconscious. But for most of us, we don't even know what's in our own unconsciouses, let alone knowing where it is or anything. I mean, it's this completely abstract, unknowable. We don't even know if it really exists. Structure. And that's at the heart, the biggest, most basic thing about Freudian theory is the existence of this unconscious that right off we've violated Occam's razor in generating. Then we go one step further and invoke any other thing. Let's say, for example, we want to try and discuss Oedipal conflict, right? So we start off being in sort of objective, we could see it kind of land, where we say that the little boy falls in love with his mother and wants to murder his father. Okay. Now we might see evidence that he wants to murder his mother, wants to marry his mother in the form of him like wanting to hold her hand or sit on her lap, or always wants to sit next to her when they're having dinner, and wanting to kiss her and tell her how pretty she is and all these things. Okay. So we might see it in those behaviors. We might see in the, in behavior towards dad that he wants to kill him. Like maybe the little boy is always sort of giving dad the cold shoulder and never wants to be near him. And no, I don't want to do the things that dad wants to do. And he's just rejecting dad all the time. So we might be able to infer it from that. Okay. But there's some inferences going on there. You don't see a little boy with a knife in his hand going after dad. You don't see him down on one knee with a ring in his hand, proposing to mom. We have to infer these things from other behaviors. So are we using the simplest explanation? Probably not. And then we go even further with the Oedipal conflict, where we have the little boy realizing, somehow we know that the little boy realizes that dad would be really mad if he found out that the little boy was trying to murder him. And so then ultimately the little boy develops castration anxiety. And then because of that castration anxiety, he decides to repress all of the things that he had been feeling. And then he decides to compensate for these feelings by identifying with dad and becoming as much like dad as he could. And look at all the steps. I got even more and more elaborate in my description of Freudian theory, because every aspect involves like a deeper and less knowable, less observable explanation of what is supposedly going on. Like, I don't think Freud ever read Occam's razor, right? We want to have the simplest explanation possible that will account for the phenomena, right? With the fewest entities. So let's think about some magical thinking. Please don't take this conversation as me dismissing all paraphenomenal things. I am the queen of watching paraphenomenal TV shows. And, I just keep wishing that science could find evidence of any of these claims, because it'd be just so fun. But let's just take Loch Ness Monster. Okay. So the premise is that maybe some Pleistocene era dinosaur has been living in that lake and presumably reproducing and for centuries, and people keep seeing it and things like that, but never very good video or picture of it. It's always grainy, or it always looks suspiciously like a stick and stuff. So the simplest explanation is that it's some kind of knowable natural phenomena. Little waves blowing in the lake, a stick, some kind of creature like an otter or something swimming in the lake, something like that. That's the simplest explanation. That's a natural known phenomena that, if we were able to get a hold of it, we'd be able to go, oh, look, it's just a stick or whatever. It takes many more steps to explain it as a Pleistocene era dinosaur, right? There's a lot more steps involved in that, a lot more entities that are going to be required. It's not the simplest explanation. The simplest explanation is it's something natural and knowable. The more complex explanation is that it's something special and different. Same thing with things like ESP. The simplest explanation is that it's a trick or a coincidence or something like that. The more complex explanation is that some people have a mystical power that, allows them to do these things, right? And I won't go into the details on it, but, right? So the simplest explanation is what we're talking about. And so if you are a person who, let's say, loves the Loch Ness Monster and completely believes that they exist, and maybe that they exist in multiple lakes, and supposedly there's one in Lake Chelan, if you believe in that, hearing me talk about it in such a dismissive way might make you say, well, I'm just a naysayer. Like, they could put the dead body of a Loch Ness Monster in front of me and I would still deny it, you might be thinking. Scientists wouldn't deny it if a dead carcass were presented in front of them, I have to say. No. In fact, like I said, for me, I think it'd be awesome if we found whatever, that there was a creature living in Lake Chelan. That would be awesome. Probably the best explanation of what might be living in Lake Chelan is those really long fish, sturgeon. It's probably that. They apparently get gigantic. Or it's wakes, because apparently they can really go across lakes for quite a while and you don't even know where the boat was. But here comes this wake from across. Anyway, so long story short, it's probably something natural, and we should always assume the simplest explanation until we have sufficient evidence to prove that it is actually the more complex thing. That's the idea, right? And so in science, we don't just sit there and deny it and go, nope, I don't care. Nope, I don't take your rotting carcass off of my doorstep. I don't believe it, right? That's not the premise. The premise is until we have evidence that can convince us otherwise, we have to go with the simplest explanation, that it's coincidence or it's, a refracting light or, something normal and knowable. Okay, now the greatest of all skeptics is James Randi, and he does such awesome things. And we're going to watch a couple of his videos throughout the quarter. He was a former magician who realized that it's a little too easy to trick us. And so he started a fund where he put $1 million in when he opened the fund as a reward to anyone who could prove under scientifically controlled conditions that they had some kind of parapsychology skill. That could be mind reading or telekinesis, where you can move things, or his example is, you claim you can levitate? Well, step out the window. Let's watch you levitate, right? So you put $1 million into a bank account, but you have to do it under controlled conditions. You're not allowed to do anything that would make it more likely that you could trick us, right? Like we have to have control of your props and stuff like that. And so far, I think just on interest, his fund, the last time I looked, was up to $1.8 million. So it's been sitting in there for a very long time. Lots of people have tried to get it, but have never been able to pass, through it under controlled conditions where they can't do a trick. They can't, somehow sleight of hand or other kinds of things. So I thought you guys might enjoy this video that I'm going to put next in the playlist. Two things I want you to note about it. First off, he's talking about debunking what do you call Uri Geller? He claimed he could bend metal and stuff with his mind alone. So he's showing how he debunked that. But the other thing I want you to notice is they're going to show footage from The Tonight Show from back in the 70s, and everybody is sitting there smoking. It's so weird to see a bunch of people sitting around smoking on TV. It used to be just such a normal thing, and now it's like, oh my gosh, it's so jarring. But so I thought you might enjoy that part of it too. So the next thing in the playlist is James Randi explaining how you can debunk and how you have to go with Occam's razor. The simplest explanation must be true. And then that will conclude this chapter's, no, it won't. I forgot about reifying hypotheses. Okay, I'll make that James Randi thing come in next in the playlist. Let me wrap up with this reification of hypotheses, because I already brought this up earlier in my lecture, so I forgot I had a slide about it. But the idea with a reification is that you have actually started to regard something abstract like a theory as if it's a material thing, as if it's something that is worthy of you having loyalty to, or you've gotten all emotionally invested in, or something like that. And so when you've started to display reification, you don't do proper falsification tests. You are starting to display evidence of the confirmation bias. And so you're looking for evidence that you're right, and you're ignoring contrary evidence. When you do have evidence that looks like it's supportive, you might do unbecoming things like trying to bolster that flimsy evidence. Like maybe your data is a little bit too widely dispersed, so you sort of throw out the outliers and then, oh, look, now I have significance. And you just start doing things that aren't very scientific in an effort to support a theory. And that's evidence that the person has really sort of fallen in love with the theory and started to treat it like it's something meaningful, that it's something important that's beyond really how meaningful and important it really is. So we want to avoid reification of hypotheses. Okay. So always remember that scientists recognize that all knowledge is provisional. We use provisional language such as "it appears as if," "this data suggests that." We use that kind of provisional language in our reports because we know that all it takes is one piece of evidence to show us that all the stuff we said is wrong. Replications might refute current results. Back in the early 1990s, a researcher reported that there was a higher risk of prostate cancer among men who had had vasectomies, and people were really freaking out about it. They were like, oh no, should I have my vasectomy reversed? And, doctors were coming on the news telling people, just because they saw this correlation does not mean that the vasectomy caused it, and relax and whatever. Well, a number of replications followed, and they used the same methodology that the original researcher had, and they found no association between vasectomy and prostate cancer. We have to always remember that there may be evidence out there waiting to be found that would show us that everything that we thought was true was not. And so we have to be always provisional in the way that we talk about the facts as we know them. And we always have to be open to the fact that we need to try and falsify what we believe so that we are not accidentally reifying our hypotheses. Okay, now I'm going to have you funnel into the James Randi video. All right, I'll see you guys in chapter 3.